Have you ever wondered if everything you think you know about Vikings is actually wrong? It's a strange feeling, isn't it, when something you've believed your entire life turns out to be largely fabrication. The horned helmets, the mindless brutality, the primitive savagery, these persistent images of Vikings have dominated our cultural consciousness for generations. But what if I told you that much of what we think we know about these Norse seafarers is built on misconceptions that would make actual Vikings laugh, or perhaps reach for their very real, very dangerous weapons? I'm fascinated by how history gets rewritten by the winners, by Hollywood, and sometimes simply through the quiet erosion of time and translation. Today, we're going to peel back those layers of misunderstanding and discover who the Vikings really were beyond the caricatures, beyond the stereotypes, and beyond the convenient narratives that have persisted for centuries. In the next 10 minutes, you'll discover why Vikings never actually wore horned helmets, why they were more entrepreneurs than mindless raiders, how advanced their society truly was, and why their legacy matters even now, over 1,000 years later. So, if you're ready to have your preconceptions challenged and to see these infamous Norse people with fresh eyes, stay with me. The story of the real Vikings is far more nuanced, sophisticated, and honestly, more interesting than what most of us have been taught. Let's start with perhaps the most pervasive misconception: Viking appearance. If you're picturing a burly warrior with a horned helmet, I have disappointing news. Vikings never wore horned helmets in battle, or really at all. This iconic image was largely a 19th century invention, popularized by costume designer Carl Emil Doppler for Wagner's Ring Cycle operas in the 1870s. The myth stuck, and now it's virtually impossible to separate Vikings from these impractical headpieces. In reality, archaeological evidence shows Vikings wore simple conical helmets made of iron, often with a guard for the nose and eyes. These were practical battle gear, not ceremonial showpieces. A horned helmet would be a liability in combat, giving enemies something to grab onto or catch a weapon on. Vikings were many things, but they weren't foolish when it came to warfare. Their appearance was also far more groomed than we might expect. Excavations have uncovered combs, tweezers, razors, and ear spoons. Yes, ear spoons, suggesting personal hygiene was important. In fact, Anglo-Saxon chronicles complain about how Viking men were too attractive to Anglo-Saxon women because they bathed weekly and took care with their appearance. Imagine that being criticized for bathing too often in the early Middle Ages. Most Vikings had light hair, which they often dyed with lye soak to achieve an even brighter blonde. They wore colorful clothing, with both men and women adorning themselves with jewelry to display their wealth and status. Far from the drab, dirty barbarians of popular imagination, Vikings cared deeply about their appearance and presentation. Now, what about their infamous reputation as ruthless raiders? Yes, Vikings did raid, that much is true. But it's also an incomplete picture. Vikings were primarily farmers, traders, explorers, and settlers. Raiding was a seasonal activity for many, something done when crops were planted that before harvest time, an economic supplement to their agricultural lifestyle, not their defining characteristic. The reason we tend to focus on their violent raids is simple. These events were recorded by their victims, particularly Christian monks who were frequent targets. Early European history was largely written by Christian scholars who naturally emphasized Viking attacks on monasteries and churches. But that's a bit like defining American history solely through its wars. It leaves out most of the story. Vikings were remarkable traders who established networks stretching from North America to the Middle East. They founded trading posts that grew into major cities like Dublin, Kiev, and Novgorod. Archaeological evidence shows they traded amber, fur, walrus ivory, and other northern goods for silver, silk, spices, wine, and glass from distant lands. They weren't just taking, they were exchanging, negotiating, and building lasting commercial relationships. Hey, I want to take a quick moment here to say that if you're enjoying this deeper dive into the reality behind the Viking myths, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell. We explore misunderstood historical topics like this regularly, always aiming to go beyond the surface-level narratives we've all been taught. Your subscription helps us continue creating content that challenges conventional wisdom and uncovers the fascinating complexities of our shared past. Now, let's talk about Viking society, which was remarkably sophisticated for its time. Contrary to the image of lawless barbarians, Vikings had complex legal systems. The Thing was an assembly where free men, and sometimes women, could participate in governance, resolve disputes, and establish laws. Iceland's Althing, established in 930 FE, is considered the world's oldest parliamentary institution and continues to this day. Women in Viking society enjoyed more rights and freedoms than many of their contemporaries in other European societies. They could own property, initiate divorce, and run businesses. While they didn't typically participate in raids, women managed farms and households during men's absences, wielding considerable domestic power. Archaeological evidence shows some women were buried with weapons, suggesting they may have fought alongside men in certain circumstances, though this remains debated among historians. The Vikings were also sophisticated storytellers and poets. Their sagas, complex narratives mixing history, mythology, and genealogy, represent some of the richest literary traditions of medieval Europe. The intricate kennings in Norse poetry, where complex metaphors replace simple nouns, calling the sea railroad, for instance, reveal a culture that valued linguistic creativity and intellectual wordplay. Their shipbuilding technology was unparalleled. The iconic one ship wasn't just a vehicle for raids, it was a marvel of engineering that revolutionized naval architecture. Light enough to navigate shallow rivers yet sturdy enough to cross open seas, maneuverable enough to be rowed yet equipped with sails to harness wind power, Viking ships were versatile tools that enabled everything from trade to exploration. The discovery of Viking settlements in Mons Aux Meadows in Newfoundland proves they reached North America nearly 500 years before Columbus, an achievement only possible because of their maritime innovation. And what of their notorious violence? Yes, Vikings could be brutal, but so could everyone else in the early Middle Ages. The Frankish Empire under Charlemagne massacred thousands of Saxons who refused to convert to Christianity. Anglo-Saxon kingdoms conducted their own raids and wars. The Byzantine Empire blinded captured enemies and engaged in political assassinations. Violence was the currency of power throughout the medieval world, not a Viking innovation. What made Vikings seem particularly horrifying to their contemporaries was their willingness to attack religious institutions, which were considered sacrosanct by Christian Europeans. But to Vikings, who followed their own religious traditions, monasteries were simply wealthy, poorly defended targets, practical rather than sacrilegious choices. Their paganism made them outsiders in a Christianizing Europe, and outsiders are always easier to demonize. Speaking of religion, Viking spirituality was far more complex than the simplified versions we often see in popular culture. Yes, they honored gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya, but their religious practices varied widely across different regions and evolved over time. They didn't have a unified church or dogma. Instead, their belief system was practical and integrated into daily life, with rituals marking seasonal changes, ensuring good harvests, and honoring ancestors. By the late Viking Age, many Norsemen had converted to Christianity, sometimes for political advantage, sometimes through genuine conviction. This conversion wasn't simply imposed from outside. It was often a gradual process of cultural negotiation, with Norse people incorporating Christian elements into their existing worldview before eventually adopting the new faith more completely. The Viking Age didn't end with a decisive battle or catastrophe. It faded as Norse societies became increasingly integrated into the broader European political and cultural landscape. The raiders became rulers, traders, and settlers. Their descendants founded dynasties in Normandy, Sicily, and Russia. Their linguistic and cultural influence persists in place names, vocabulary, and legal traditions throughout Northern Europe and beyond. So who were the real Vikings? They were farmers who sailed, traders who fought, poets who explored. They were a people of contradictions, capable of brutal violence yet governed by sophisticated laws, traditional in some ways yet remarkably adaptable and innovative in others. They weren't the one-dimensional barbarians of popular imagination, but complex human beings navigating a changing world with the tools and values they had developed. The real Viking story matters because it reminds us how easily history becomes distorted when viewed through a single lens, especially when that lens belongs to those who feared or opposed them. It teaches us to question simplified narratives about civilized versus barbaric peoples. And it shows how cultures that seem alien or threatening can contain sophistication, innovation, and humanity that deserves recognition. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this. Were you surprised by any of these Viking realities? Do you have questions about aspects of Norse culture we didn't cover today? Drop your comments below and hit that like button if you've learned something new. And if you haven't already, subscribe to join our community of history enthusiasts who enjoy looking beyond the surface of conventional narratives. Be sure to check the description box for books and resources I recommend if you want to explore authentic Viking history further, as well as ways you can support the channel if you find value in our content. Until next time, remember that history is always more complex and often more fascinating than the simplified stories we inherit.